one. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the August edition of the SWOG webinar. Tonight, we are joined for the third time by Paul Moseley, and we are looking at soil health and tree biology. There will be a quiz involved in this, I am promised. So, those of us who know Paul know that his website is very good and it's a source of great information. We've got woodland management plans that many of us have downloaded and used. It's been updated recently, so please make sure you check it out. I'll pass over to Paul now and he can tell us all about soil health. Take it away, Paul.
Good evening, everybody. Yes, my name is Paul. My background, I started off as a community forester, or rather I was trained to become a community forester, which is basically forestry, but really looking at spaces that people actively use day to day, rather than slightly further out, slightly more impressive perhaps sites. These are your everyday, around the corner kind of sites. Then I became a countryside ranger over in Leicestershire, and was opened up to a wonderful world of archaeology and geology and all the subjects in school I didn't really pay attention to, if I'm honest, but suddenly they sort of came to life for me. Currently I'm a woodland creation officer with a local authority. So yeah, woodlands have always been my thing. If I've not been doing them professionally, I've been doing them personally. I've been involved with, traditional ecological knowledges and skills and things like this. So I am not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. However, in the job, I've had to pick up a whole wealth of information and knowledge and, dare I say, wisdom from the people that I've worked with predominantly. So I think sharing is really, really important, which is why I really like to do these kinds of things. It helps somebody in some way, then that makes me happy. So the two talks we've done before, one was looking at how can we think about woodlands in a way that means we can begin to understand sort of the processes, start to understand where we can intervene. And so we looked at what's called succession, where really within woodlands, within most habitats, there's really only one of five things happening. Stuff's either starting, stopping, speeding up, slowing down, reversing. And then on the last one, we looked at woodland survey. And yeah, there's a survey form, a very generic one that you find lots of different places, but there's a link that you can download. I'm sure Sarah can share it again if anyone didn't catch that and wants to get this one. And then for the life of me, I can't remember how or why, but I agreed to do one on soil health. Sarah and I just sometimes chat away and I say something and then they go, right, you're doing a talk on that. So yeah, we're going to talk about soil health, which sometimes can feel a little bit too scientific-y because you're getting into chemistry essentially in lots of ways. But we're going to take a kind of flight over the top of it and look at some of the important principles. And we're going to dip into some of the biology, both for soil and trees as we go, just to kind of give a little bit of context, just to flesh things out a little bit. Not that you then have to obviously remember all of those elements, but it can hopefully just give you a sense of understanding there's a process that's going on behind the things that we're saying. Okay, so let me see if this works. Hey, there we go. So the plan for the talk this evening is we want to understand what it is about woodland soils, makes them slightly unique, something that we need to be concerned about and think about and cherish. Think about their ecological importance. What is it about them and the relationships that they have, which means they're so important. Talk about things like phloems and lignins and mycorrhiza. So these are the bits of biology we're going to get into, what they do, how they work, why they're important. And we're going to think about some basic principles that we can take away. So woodland soils. Let's just think about woodlands for a moment. Unless we're dealing with a newly planted area, woodlands tend to have been around for a little while. Now, that's a really significant, if slightly obvious, statement that as woodlands are growing, as they're living, as they're existing, they are constantly going through all of these processes. And these processes, they're not necessarily a zero-sum game. Everything that comes into a woodland doesn't necessarily equate that something leaves. Woodlands become richer environments over time. Um, and as part of all of those relationships, obviously the soil is part of that ecosystem. And as we'll look at and talk about, really the foundation of everything. And so as a space starts to become a woodland, things are falling off. Leaves are dropping, branches are falling, little microscopic bits of dust from the bark, or the bark that's dust, is breaking down, falling off. And all of these things fall into the soil and get broken down in the soil. And then what happens to them? Well, they don't necessarily just disappear into the ether. They don't necessarily get washed away by the rain. Some do, but a lot of it stays in the soil and then gets picked up again. So unlike agricultural soils, unlike urban soils, there's a real richness to woodland soil structures and contents. But that's not to say that they're um, not necessarily going to be like that forever. There are things that happen, there are things that we can be doing that's actually going to be denuding the soils. It's going to be limiting the opportunity to be this really rich foundation for the woodland itself. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at principally three different aspects of tree biology and begin to understand why the soil health is so important. So we could look at just soil itself, but understanding it in the context of tree biology means that we can understand those relationships. And really, woodland and woodland management and ecology is all about relationships. Okay, so some of the key characteristics of woodland soils. Very, very high in organic content. So again, all of those things that are falling off, they don't just disappear. You'll see it all of the time as you're walking around. Even from the last autumn, you'll see leaves, you'll see sticks, and you'll see them break down over time. But a healthy woodland will always have litter. It will always have these little microcosms, these little microclimates. Underneath there, if you were to pick up a stone or a stick or a leaf, you'll maybe find some invertebrates. You'll certainly find a little bit of moisture that's been retained, and especially with the summer that we've just had. One of the biggest issues we've had where I work at the moment is the hottest, driest summer and spring, actually, spring and summer, in 100 years. And that means it's an incredibly challenging environment for trees to actually take root and to start to grow. Their first year of life is kind of crucial, as it is with humans. Um, and so where you find little bits of shade, as you have these warmer days, these hotter periods, this drier summer, suddenly those bits of shade make all of the difference to what is trying to grow in there. Within that as well, you've got all these little microbial communities as well. You've got these little wetter spaces where different things can live, whether it's fungi, whether it's bacteria, like I say, invertebrates. And all of those things are actively involved with creating healthy soil. So in a moment, I'm going to show you perhaps the simplest diagram to understand, well, woodland sort of biology, really, but particularly soil biology. Um, and everything goes somewhere. And we need to think about what are the avenues where things can go, which ones have we created, which ones are natural within the ecology, which ones are we damaging. And if we were to go, for example, and we were to cut grass that things are trying to exist within, suddenly there's less shade, there's going to be less moisture because it's going to evaporate. And the habitat, the micro habitats that they were in, suddenly has now disappeared. And we start to impact on biodiversity really, really immediately. And the other thing as well, the last point is just underlining how important those relationships are. So all of the complex food webs that everything way. So you've got the primary producers that capture things like sunlight, they can catch water, things feed off them, things feed off them, things feed off them. So again, this idea of relationships is absolutely key. So occasionally what I do find, and obviously here we're talking to people who own woodlands or are part of managing woodlands, sometimes it feels like there are these great big monstrous trees that we're really not going to have much of an impact on unless we go in with a chainsaw. But actually, just the way in which we're walking and the ways in which we're habitually in those spaces can actually start to have a bit of an impact. Okay, so this is the diagram that I mentioned. It's essentially a triangle. Okay, so we think about the biomass. Let's start with that. So these are the trees. Okay, includes the plants and so on, but we'll just deal with trees for the moment. So we have the trees, and you have various tissues coming off them, leaves, branches, etc., that become litter. They become the floor of the forest. So if we were to follow this back just around into a triangle, as that litter breaks down, as it decomposes, it's then going to release nutrients into the soil. And what lives off the soil? Well, the trees do. So straight away, you can see a very, very obvious cycle there. But there's a couple of other little inputs and outputs as well. So with soil, we've also got the bedrock, and the bedrock being weathered and broken down over time. When I put surveys together for, is this site potentially a site where we're going to plant some woodland? I have to look at things like soil types. So if we think about different soil types, we have something like clay, which is obviously well known for its ability to hold on to water, where even the slightest little shower, suddenly we've got a quagmire. And then we've got other things like we've got more loamy, sandstony kind of spaces, where there the soil will just loose the water as soon as it stops raining. So you can have places that are very much engineered, if you like, to allow water to move on, and you've got places that are very much engineered to be able to hold on to water. And then different species prefer different places. So you will find things like willow in those places that have clay quite a lot because it retains water, and willow loves water. Okay, so there are all kinds, again, of different relationships and layers we can go into here, but very simply what we want to look at is this triangle. We have trees, they drop things, that rots into the soil is then used by the trees. So
I'm going to put my
it,
machine ready.
someone might just need to mute themselves, sorry. So when we start to think about this, we need to think about what can we do to damage this cycle. When I was a trainer, I was teaching people how to use the outdoors. There was a campsite used by the Scouts down in the southern part of the country. And the first time I went down there, one of the first things I noticed, and this is a woodland campsite, was how sort of pristine the floor was. There was not a stick. There was barely a leaf, if I'm really honest. And I met the wardens, and the wardens were taking me around and showed me this. And one of the things they did, and they were quite proud of this, is they said, yeah, so what we do is we gather up all the dead wood and we put it into a pile over here so that everybody can come and gather firewood as and when they need it. Now, from an ecology point of view, that's going to have a detrimental impact on the woodland, because what you're doing is you're taking this layer that exists right throughout the woodland with all those little microclimates, with all of the all the rotting down that it's going to be going on, all of the decomposition that's happening, and you're scraping it and you're moving it into one space. Yes, it looks very, very neat for those that think that's an important thing in woodlands, but ecologically, it's quite devastating. Just to kind of finish this story off, one of the funny things that happened is that the one of the two wardens, it was a husband and wife team that were wardening. The wife took me off to one side and she said, "I hate the fact he keeps cleaning up the entire woodland. When you come here and you do training courses, can you work on him? Can you try and convince him to not do that? Because they would have liked to have seen it more natural." So yeah, there can be a little bit of an impulse, an instinct even, to sometimes clean up woodland spaces, to make them look managed, to make them look cared for. And I understand that. But equally, ecologically, it is going to have a detrimental effect. There is a wonderful saying, I can't remember who said it now, which is something along the lines of, there's no greater artist than the natural world. And what they were trying to say was, there's absolutely no way that by design, by management, can we create all of those little relationships in all of the nuanced ways that are actually really, really important. So if you have to do some management, then obviously we need to do it. But otherwise, if we can try and restrain ourselves a little bit, the natural world is very, very good at taking care of itself. So there we go. So we need to look at a little bit at tree biology here. I've put all of this text here so that when you download this, you've got all of this. We're not going to go through all of this right now. But essentially, what we want you to think about is on the outside of a tree, you have the bark, okay? And to think of that as a jacket in the winter. It literally helps regulate the warmth, the temperature of the tree. It helps protect it from the elements, helps protect it from attack as well. So you've got insects, for example, that are trying to burrow in to make homes, to lay eggs, etc. You've got woodpeckers trying to make nests. The bark is there as a protective layer. Well, just inside of that, you've got what's called the phloem. Okay, now if you were to go to a tree and to take a knife or even the back of a spoon, for example, just something with a little bit of an edge, and you were to scrape that bark, straight away underneath it, you'll probably see a very vibrant green layer that's distinct from the bark. Well, that's the phloem. That's a living layer, and the phloem is one of, if not the most important layer, if you like, in terms of what could we be damaging innocently that's going to have the biggest impact on a tree's health. Now, you'll see this with deer. Those of you with deer in your woodland, you'll probably see them eating the bark. It's actually the phloem that they're really interested in because it's full of nutrients. Okay, but sometimes you will go to places and there are, how should we describe them? Sometimes enthusiastic groups that like to be out in the outdoors, and someone brought an axe one time or something of that nature, and they don't understand the impact they're having by just hitting a tree. But as soon as you break through that outer bark and you start to hit the phloem, all of the vertical channels that would carry sugars and waters and other nutrients up and down the trunk, all of those get cut. Now, the phloem can be repaired, but it's quite a difficult, labor-intensive job for the tree. So sometimes you will find damage in a bark that never really heals. You'll actually find that the tree grows over and around it. If you've ever been breaking down some firewood, for example, and you split a log in half, sometimes you'll be able to see a tree branch that you can see on the exterior, but then you can trace it all the way back, almost like an X-ray. So trees grow by adding layers. So when damage occurs, the damage is not necessarily carried out with the tree carries on around the damage. And that's where you can sometimes, as you cut down a tree, if you need to manage it, or you need firewood, you can suddenly find these little inclusions where the bark has been damaged, the phloem has been damaged, it's never repaired itself, but the rest of the tree has managed to carry on growing. Also in there as well, you've got what's called the cambium. Now the cambium is what creates a new layer of wood. Okay, so you've essentially got these two incredibly crucial layers just underneath the bark, okay, that if we were a little bit careless by damaging the bark, we could also then be damaging. So these two layers are active in growing the tree, but also repairing the tree. And they're also there in terms of the warfare of diseases that attack trees as well. So the bark is sort of the brick wall, if you like, the concrete wall that tries to just create a physical barrier. But then you've got the phloem and the cambium on the inside, and they have real important roles to play in terms of protecting a tree from infestation. So this phloem, the inner bark, it's essential for nutrients. Where does it get those nutrients from? Well, it carries the nutrients from the roots up through the bark, up through the phloem itself, up to the rest of the tree, to the leaves. It carries sugars down from the leaves, down into the roots. So the leaves can't gather nutrients, they produce sugars. The roots can't produce sugars, they carry nutrients. So the phloem is the way in which all of those materials are shared around. So it's a crucial, crucial layer. So not only do we need healthy soils for it to be able to transport them, but we need healthy soils for it to actually look after itself as well. It's a little bit like, in a family. If you are looking after everybody else, then sometimes you realize you're really tired and cranky. Sometimes you need to look after yourself. So the phloem's job is not only to look after the rest of the tree, but it also actually has to prioritize itself as well. And that can really happen if we've got healthy soils. So when we start to think about soils, straight away, we're starting to create this biological link It's not just this medium that trees grow in, that it holds on to, that roots dive into. It's literally sucking the goodness out of the soil and then returning it. And one of the processes that it does that through is by the flow. So this is a pop quiz woodland identification challenge. So on the next slide, there is going to be an illustration of something that is all out throughout the woodlands. And I want to see who can identify it first. Okay, so get ready to put in the chat what this is. Okay, everyone ready? 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, so you all know what this is, obviously. It's everywhere in the woodland. So this is the building block of the very woodland itself. Okay, this is a chemical profile of what's called lignin. I'm actually intrigued. The chat has suddenly ticked up, like there's like 100 biologists in the room that now know what that is. So lignin is the cell wall, if you like. Okay, so on this image here, on my left, I think be your left, we've got a little sliver of wood. If we were to zoom into that, essentially what we'll find is lots and lots of little tunnels. And depending on the species, some of them are short tunnels, some of them are very long tunnels, but the actual wall of the tunnel is made from a chemical called lignin. Okay, now inside of that, you've got all of the cellulose and all of the goodness, if you like, of the tree itself. The lignin is the very structure of the tree. So as a tracker, one of the things we do is we sometimes look at how do things decompose in the woodland. And sometimes we can find where deer have been, not necessarily because we can see their trails or their footprints even, but because they keep walking over where a log has fallen down. If you were to put a log out into a woodland and it was just the weather, it was just the rain, the wind that was breaking it down, you'll find it becomes a powder over time. So what's happened there, that process in decomposition, is that the cell walls have broken down and the inside of the cell, the cellulose, there's lots of other stuff, but we'll keep it simple for now. The cellulose on the inside is exposed. If you were to have a log out in a woodland and you were to put it over a path, for example, you'll find lots of people stepping on it. Animals do the same as well. They step on logs as they come across them. What you're finding there is that the structure is breaking down much, much quicker. So it's not rotting down, it's being broken down. And what you'll find is quite light, aerated wood. It'd be bleached by the sun as well. So you can still see the structure. You can just recognize it. If someone was to bring it back, you'd recognize it as wood, but it's incredibly light. So that's the lignin, or that's where most of the lignin has been left. And the content, the inside of the cell, has been worked away. So depending on whether something breaks down very, very slowly or something gets broken down quite quickly, you end up with either the lignin left or the lignin getting broken down and taken away. So the lignin is, think about it almost like the bones of a tree, okay? So we need to have really, really healthy soil for the tree through the phloem to be able to suck up those nutrients from the soil, to be able to then convert it into lignin to then be able to grow. Okay, so we think about trees growing, we recognize there's a main trunk, we recognize there's main branches, and then there's twigs. So on a cellular level, this lignin that's being created, this cell structure in which it will put a lot of its energy stores, that itself is dependent upon healthy soils. And in particular, when you start to look at species, certain species prefer different soils. And the reason why they prefer different soils is that there are different chemicals within those soils that allow it to produce the kind of lignin that it uses for its cellular structure. So when we start to think about woodland creation, woodland management, we start to recognize that certain trees prefer certain habitats. Sometimes that's due to water. Sometimes that's exposure to sunlight, for example. Some prefer the shade. Sometimes it's literally the chemical composition of the soil that makes the difference as to how successful they can be. So this is why one of the reasons why you can go to a very, very similar space and have the same species that's probably been planted or self-set at roughly the same time, and end up with dramatically different performances in the trees. And it's because of the soil. So the more the soil is able to, sorry, the more the tree is able to access the nutrients from the soil, the more it's been broken down, the more decomposers there are in there, the less wash off that there is with the rain or flooding happening and washing away those nutrients, the more that's retained and is bioavailable, the more lignin can be produced, the more the tree can grow, the quicker it can get out and spread its, I was going to say wings then, that's saying, the more it can spread its branches to harvest the sunlight. And so it's actually happening from then two different ends. So when you've got depleted soils, when you've got washed out soils, when you've got soils that are constantly getting disturbed or compacted, then you suddenly make it harder for the tree to be able to produce that lignin. So when you go to a spot and you realize there's a path walking through, start to pay attention to those trees that are growing near the path versus those trees that are growing further in away from that path. That compaction on the path is having an impact on the bioavailability of these chemicals, these nutrients within the soil for those trees to make use of. It's not that trees are allergic to humans. We can get quite close to a tree and it's fine. It never stops sneezing. But that compaction that's happening is making it harder for the tree on a chemical level to be able to draw out those nutrients to do what it wants to do, which is grow. The third one, everyone kind of knows about this. There's been a great, I was going to say like an ad campaign then, but there's been a great awareness raising in the last 10 to 15 years about mycorrhizal fungi and those networks. There's actually different kinds. You have got some kinds that literally just live off the litter and don't really engage with the root structures of trees much. But there are many which are integrated with all of the root structures of many, many different trees and many different species of trees. Now, one of the things that does happen with the kind of story, if you like, of mycorrhizal fungi is it gets slightly co-opted that mycorrhizal fungi are kind of everybody's friends and it just wants the world to be a happy place, which it's a lovely story. But really what's happening is that, yes, there's a lot of connection. There's a lot of mutual relationships that are formed. The mycorrhizal fungi can draw off nutrients that it needs. It makes other nutrients more available to the trees, but it also has its favorites. There's some wonderful studies which show how the parent trees, when they're connected to their juvenile descendants, the mycorrhizal fungi is stronger between them. So therefore, the exchange of nutrients prioritizes that little cluster, that little family. And you'll find that between species that, between trees of the same species, those mycorrhizal fungi networks are stronger because they are speaking the same language, if you like. So yes, they all do interconnect. Yes, they all do communicate in various ways. When I say communicate, this is chemical, obviously. But they do have favorites and they do prioritize their similar species or certainly their descendants. However, mycorrhiza is a phenomenal resource and one that perhaps is more delicate than people realize. When we think about compaction, we're making it harder for some species more than others, mycorrhizal fungi, to actually develop and maintain their network. If we think about disturbing the soil, if we're doing some landscaping, some footpath work, etc., we're exposing the soil, we're perhaps changing the moisture levels within it, which again can make a mycorrhizal fungi network draw back. But it's an essential building block. It's the what is the phrase that I found actually? All the years I've been doing it, I only recently heard this term, the Wood Wide Web. It's because I don't hang around with children, school groups and things much. But I've been finding that lots and lots of teachers and educationists in the outdoors are using this term, the Wood Wide Web, which I really, really like actually. And it's this notion of everything is interconnected and the processes change, but that interconnection still remains in some way. There are still relationships. I think with the mycorrhizal, it's a more literal connection. It literally is a physical connection between all of these different species. And what's a really crucial role of the mycorrhizal fungi, or what's a byproduct, if you like, of the mycorrhizal fungi? Well, as a way of communicating, if you are holding someone's hand, for example, and they were to suddenly squeeze it, you would probably assume there's some emotional reaction that's going on for them. Maybe they've been startled, maybe they just want to show you lots of affection, who knows? But it means something. So just like with the mycorrhizal fungal network, when the chemical profiles are changing amongst different parts of the mycorrhizal network, it is signaling to other trees that something is going on. And quite often, one of those things is that there was a disease in the woodland. A tree has perhaps become infected by something, sudden oak death, for example. Obviously, we've now had the huge impact on the ash species, but now there's some resistance that's being reported as well, which is fantastic. And I think part of that is by mycorrhizal fungi educating other trees almost. So they've been warned this is coming, and then the trees can actually defend themselves a little bit more. They can prepare, they can throw up their chemical defenses. And you'll see in firewood that when you're in a woodland with a really, really, really healthy mycorrhizal network, when there's a really, really healthy soil within that woodland, when you are chopping wood, or you find a piece of wood that's just fallen apart, you will find lots and lots of fungal bodies in the wood. So where you find dark lines within wood, it's actually the meeting point between two fungal bodies. They set up a chemical barrier in between them. And when you have healthy soils, you tend to find those more and more in the trees, because what's happening is that the fungi are so healthy, they can get in the trees. Yes, the trees are suffering in certain ways, but you're demonstrating, you're able to see, you're witnessing the fact that the soil is so healthy, the mycorrhizal fungi is so healthy, that actually we're finding that the wood is starting to create more and more, and sometimes symbiotic relationships, other times not, relationships with the fungi itself. So if you're ever kind of wondering about your soil health, have a look at your firewood if you are collecting firewood from your woodland. How many fungal barriers are you finding? If you're not finding any, it might mean that your soil is perhaps not the healthiest. So yeah, I've already spoken about quite a bit of this actually. One of the other things as well that mycorrhizal fungi do is they help manage water levels, not on an overall landscape level, but on a chemical level. The richer the mycorrhizal fungi network within the soil is, the more you will find it can actually retain moisture. And as we know, water is absolutely crucial. And as we know, we're now starting to get spring and summer that are the hottest, driest that we've had in 100 years. So the mycorrhizal fungi network is now doing an even more important job in terms of retaining moisture within the soil for the trees to then be able to use. So I can't emphasize enough, and you're probably convinced of this before you came here this evening, healthy soils is everything. It is not just the foundation for tree health, it is the foundation for biodiversity, bottom line. So in your woodlands, if you find, for example, you have some healthy trees, but you're not necessarily getting a lot of ground flora, this could again be an indication of the soil is not as healthy as it could be, the mycorrhizal networks are not as extended and interconnected as they might be. So then we have to start thinking about, well, what might have happened to impact on that? And then we can start thinking about what we need to do in the future. So soil compaction is quite a big one. Now, obviously, in some woodlands, there can be heavy machinery that's been bought in the past. Maybe it's been a softwood timber stand that's been felled, and there's now a succession of something else that's coming up, birch woodland, for example. Well, that compaction doesn't suddenly disappear overnight. Sometimes it can take decades for the soil to aerate itself again. Again, partly due to the mycorrhizal fungi creating those fibers, partly rainwater has been shown to be quite an important thing. If a land can get rain onto it, the water obviously is forcing its way through, it's expanding the soil as it goes, so it's aerating it. So we need to think about what is it that we're doing to our woodlands and how are we literally impacting on the soil itself. So this is where footpath design can be quite important. It could be, and we used to do this with forest schools and things like this. we realize that if we've been in an area for a while, the chances are we're having an impact on it. I mean, certainly something literally like forest school, you're collecting firewood. If you're collecting firewood, that means you're taking it out of the cycle. But even just your footprints have an impact. If you're in a certain area quite a lot, the compaction is going to build up over time. And the way to address that is to give that area a break. So it could be that you look at every few years, you start to change the ways in which you're using the woodland. Maybe you have particular areas you like to go and do things. Maybe that changes. Maybe the ways in which you're walking through the woodland, that changes as well. And what it means is you're giving everything a chance to have a little bit of aeration, to get back to the point where everything that's growing in and around that area can start to use the nutrients as it would were it not for the soil compaction itself. Uh, Along with that, obviously, you've got erosion. So you've got things like if you were to train the site to be able to get rid of its water, and it's understandable why you should do that sometimes. It's not always a bad thing. But if you are putting in drainage, or if you're opening up drainage, then obviously you're going to have water leaving the site at a higher rate than it has previously. And within that water, there are going to be nutrients. The rainwater doesn't just go along the surface of the woodland. uh, it obviously goes right through the soil itself. And as it does, it picks up nutrients as it goes. One of the key things as well is thinking about the herbicides and the other chemicals that you're putting in there. Now, herbicides, as councils, which I'm looking for at the minute, we've vastly reduced those over the years. If we were to go back to the 80s, it was everywhere. It was the first thing you used to do to anything was spray it with herbicide. Thankfully, now it's a very, very different world. People understand the impacts of it. Um, so what I would say is where you're thinking about your woodland management, the herbicide should always be a last resort in my book. Because yes, you're dealing with a job in a quick and efficient way, but that herbicide doesn't disappear. And even though Roundup and things like this nowadays is very, very good, it's still having an impact during the period in which it's active within the soil. So what I would say is try to reduce the amount of chemicals, the non-natural materials, try to reduce the amount that you're putting into woodland, because it does have an interplay with all of the soil chemistry and soil biology, and that does have a legacy going forward. And then going back to the story that I told sort of towards the beginning, think about, are you over clearing? Are you trying to make it really presentable? Which the natural world isn't necessarily for that purpose. Or do you feel like you are perhaps collecting too much firewood? Maybe you've bought a woodland for that purpose, but if the woodland means something to you and you want it to, have a life and to maybe pass it on to others in the future in a reasonable state, think about how can we start to really look at what is the woodland able to provide us with, and make sure that we're only really taking what that is rather than taking everything that we would want to consume ourselves. So a couple of very basic principles, just drawing from all the things that we've said, really. So think about how can you minimize soil disturbance. You want to avoid digging as much as you can. You want to certainly avoid heavy machinery because there's compaction in there as well. You want to make sure that you're leaving as much leaf litter as humanly possible, and deadwood as well. So again, thinking about, do we need to be tidying up areas? Do we need to be moving things? Or actually, if we leave them, we're providing really, really important microclimates that in turn is going to be helping produce that mycorrhizal network. It's going to be making in turn everything more available for the trees in terms of repairing, developing their phloem, growing in terms of lignin, and thinking about having a varied biome as well, thinking about how many different species could we encourage to be in here. And this might even include things like going into neighboring woodlands, with permission, obviously, and gathering wildflower seed that therefore it's local in the area. It's local provenance as well. It's a seed stock that's genetically tied to that particular area, and scattering it, because then by enriching the ground flora, you're enriching all of those different interactions from the mycorrhiza through to making different nutrients biochemically available, because different species have different impacts on the soil itself. And I know we've talked about and have had lots of questions before from people about traditional woodland practices. Um, they're more than just lovely kitsch things. They are wisdom, to use the word that I used at the very beginning. There were generations upon generations of people that figured out we can harvest and live by what we can gather from the woodlands, and we can do it in a way which means the woodlands are still around and still healthy to be able to provide that for us in the future. The definition of sustainability. So, kind of adding a dimension then into thinking about not only are there enough trees, are there enough healthy trees, but how are the trees interacting with the soil, and how is the soil being cared for in terms of its long-term sustainability as well, I think is a incredibly important thing to consider. And again, just try to avoid chemicals and fertilizers and all those kind of things as much as possible, and to try to learn how to read the woodland, which there's a lovely phrase that we get from tracking, which is called dirt time, by just spending time in it and being attentive to it. And the way in which I teach, I teach at various universities, I talk about kinship, and I'm not going to go into it too much now. We had a great talk, was it last month, Sarah, from someone talking about relationships to the natural world. But think of woodlands almost like a relative. How would you care for them? Well, the first thing to do would be to try and listen to them. What are they telling us is wrong with them?
That was
And obviously,
Brown's
we speak.
webinar, wasn't it? That was
That
Brown's
was it.
webinar.
Yeah,
He's here
yeah.
tonight.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. So go back and watch that, and Sarah will be able to provide you with a link for it. But that sense of trying to relate to the land, trying to understand it, trying to understand where is it at in terms of its health. How do I listen to it? How do I learn from it? That I think is the underlying message in terms of how do we really care for woodlands. There's loads of techniques. There's loads of chemistry that's involved. There's loads of models that can be thought of. But I think being attentive and caring for them as if they were a relative of ours, which essentially they are, I think that is the underlying point, really. I can't remember what else there was now. Oh, yeah, so just the summary. So again, just to reiterate that point of, if we want to have really, really good woodlands, really healthy woodlands to go and enjoy, to go and have birthday parties, to go and relax in a hammock, to gather firewood from, ultimately it comes from what is happening in the soil. And we can be attentive to that, and we can recognize that it literally is the living foundation of everything that's happening in that woodland. Or, and what we see in a number of occasions, is that people really focus on what are we producing from the woodland or how we're using the woodland. And that's when you start to notice that by inattention over time, the woodlands start to really suffer. Okay, so we're going to open up to, I heard this phrase a little while ago, a couple of weeks ago, and I loved it, a Q&A-ish. So a Q&A is, you ask a question. If I know the answer, I'll tell you. If not, I'll volunteer somebody else, or I'll give you a suggestion as to somewhere else you can go, because I don't know everything. So I don't know if, Sarah, if there's already questions that have come up or not that we can jump to, or if you want to give
There
people a
are,
couple of
yeah.
moments.
If anybody's just logged in, it looks like you're offering them a quiche, but Q&A-ish.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm slow.
It's
Sorry.
my sense of humor. Right. So, where were we? A little bit of chat about phloem in other fruity species like orange and the stringy bits on bananas. And then Sue speaks about, I think it ties in, you said if there was a trauma to a tree and then it would grow around it. She gives an example of that. Three people guessed correctly. The big chemical, the lignin.
Fantastic.
I was not one of those people. And then where were we? Some people asking for slides. All right. So Bob asked the question, why do some plants or trees grow better in poor soils? Is it due to lack of competition, or is poor soil just a bad term?
Um, That's a really interesting question. I love exploring language, so I love the fact that question is asking about language. So to take a nice example, heathland, and this kind of ties back into succession. So yes, if you were to take something like heather, it would always be outcompeted by species such as trees, because essentially what's happening is as soil gets richer and richer, then it gives an opportunity for other things to come in. I'm trying to think if I've ever heard a different term used instead of poorer. I've heard the term specific. It's a specific soil, which I liked. Um, but it's about the habitats really. So when you start to look at habitats, soils and plant communities, and obviously animal communities, they have distinct relationships, and none are better than the others, but they are unique. They're different. So in this case, we've been looking at woodland. If I was to be talking about heathland, I'd be saying as much as you can, take stuff off, get rid of it, burn it, do whatever you can, not chemicals, never chemicals, but do all those things because we want to denude, that's the other term I heard. We want to denude the soil, because that gives an opportunity for heather to establish itself and grow, and obviously all the other plant communities. So just to kind of link back, I think probably Brown talked about this in his, when we talk about the history of ecology in just this little island of ours, it was once a case where you had these sprawling habitats that all went through these different cycles of I can say the word now, succession. And so you would have places that are becoming more denuded, which gave heather a chance and heathland to exist, whilst other heathland is being enriched because of tree felling and water level changes, etc. And then that heathland is becoming woodland. We're not in that situation anymore. We've got everything cut up by human civilization. So we tend to think about microcosms now. We tend to think about very small portions. Even when you're talking about 200 hectares, it's a tiny, tiny little speck of land, really, if we're honest. So we're now talking about how do we, within very, very small little parcels, try to get the best we can with the resources that we've got. I could go into a whole political speech about how the entire sort of countryside industry has been destroyed since the 80s, and we don't have the resources we have to do the job we need to do, but I won't. I don't know if that answers the question. I can go off on tangents sometimes, but I hope it was somewhat useful.
Yeah, I think that was useful, Paul. I hazarded a guess. I likened the poor soil to, when you get like the sort of the ugly, odd looking fish at the bottom of the ocean that they've got like a low oxygen demand, or you get like extremophiles that can live in like extreme temperatures or pHs. Like something will always adapt to live in some, I thought it was a bit like that, but I'm just drawing on A-level biology from 25 years ago. So
You have to think about the aesthetics of ugly fish.
yeah,
Denuded fish, I think is what we might call
pretty to somebody.
them.
um, so um, Anthony Mills recommends a book called Susan Simard's Finding the Mother Tree, which maybe perhaps coined the term Wood Wide Web. And so he recommends some things there. And then I think there was quite a debate that was seeded when you said about not using chemicals and trying to just read the land and do that. So we have got some strong opinions on Roundup. And
Yeah,
then
no, that's bound to happen. Like I say, I've been around sort of forestry and countryside rangering for 30 odd years now. And the conversation has changed radically during that time. There are people that are huge proponents for it in terms of efficiency. Obviously, the chemicals themselves are far more sophisticated nowadays than they used to be, which is great. We should acknowledge that.
yeah.
I think about, so without getting into too much of a tangent, I come from a ethno-ecological background, which is
Mm.
there are ways of doing things, and then there's ways of thinking about the places that we're involved with, which influences the way in which we do things. So I'm really interested in, if we were to start to think about how do we really form a kinship and listen to the land, we start to change the timescales in which we want things to happen, and therefore we can change the ways in which those things happen.
Mm.
That's another webinar some other time.
That's good to know. Your trilogy of four, like Douglas Adams. That's a nice segue into Ulrika's comment question. Um, Ulrika is planning to plant a hedge on a meadow, which is part of the woodland that they've bought. The contractor included herbicides around the young hedge plants in the proposal he sent to reduce the competition from grasses. Is there any way, to your knowledge, that this could be avoided?
Yeah, you can use mulch. It's something that's been used more and more. It's more labor intensive, obviously. It's more expensive in terms of the material costs as well. But if you really want to go down the route of trying to avoid chemicals as much as humanly possible, then mulch mats as well. There's some great products out there that you can use where it's all natural material. It's biodegradable over 4 or 5 years or so. But obviously, there's a cost implication with that as well.
Okay. Yeah, somebody else echoed your thoughts on mulch and also how long it takes. But a mulch mat, that is something that wasn't suggested, so thank you. Um, do you think, Ian asks, do you think there is a place for using bore on temporary short-term basis within woodlands with degraded soils to aerate and turn over soil?
There's a fascinating book which I've literally just treated myself to, which is all about the potential for the reintroduction of bore and the action, the physical, I think they call it the embodied presence of the bore, or something really academically interesting. Yeah, it's this sense of there are things, it's like shire horses when you use them for forestry. If you go into a space that's been muddled or scarified by shire horses in this sense, then you find there's all these little micro habitats that are created literally in the depression, the foot depression of the horse. You've suddenly got this very shaded little damp area where all sorts of different things can grow and live. I think it's a wonderful idea and a wonderful project. With my sort of researcher hat on, the data needs to be gathered for much longer to really understand what's going on. But in other countries, we do see that there is great value to having boar in woodland. We also obviously have to think about how people feel about having boar in the woodland next door and all those kind of things. But in terms of purely a how does it work in an ecological fashion, I think the reintroduction of lost members of our ecology, I'm certainly sat on the side of we should be exploring this more.
It's just reminded me of a previous webinar about truffles, finding truffles, and they used pigs, but the fashion has gone away from using pigs because people lose fingers, which is a
Mm.
consideration, which is why they start using truffle hounds. But I quite like the idea of having a boar. Um, we could also use the England football team, the men's one, because they've got their football boots. They could churn up the ground because they're not winning as much as the women.
I see.
I'll sneak that in. Anthony is giving some advice. Oh no, that was to do with mulch. Um, More thoughts on insecticides. Okay, Mike asks, is the transfer of immunity from an infected tree and its neighbours just a warning to mobilise defences? Oh, hang on. Sorry, the question scrolled away while I was reading it. Um, oh gosh, where's it gone? Just a warning to mobilise defences, a chemical transfer, or even an immune response. So the transfer of immunity from an infected tree to its neighbours, a warning. Is that
So I'm not.
mycorrhizal, like the information transfer?
Yeah, so this has been spoken about quite a lot. From my reading of the research, and I will say it has been limited. I've been trying to cover it. Um, there's some interesting research in terms of how basically a biochemical response is information anyway. And what is it that we're doing when we're talking? Well, we're physically doing something. There's a biochemical reaction in our brains that computes what it means and all these kind of things. So what I found in the research is that there's a little bit of, I want to say, a category error, which is that if it's one thing, it's a bit like this, so therefore it is. So I would personally, and again, there are other people that know far more than me about this, I would personally hold back from saying it's about information transfer. I would say that within an ecology, within any relationship-rich environment, you are going to have responses that causes responses. And I would say, in terms of categorizing what it is, that's what's happening with mycorrhizal fungi networks.
Hmm.
And if anybody knows anything different, please send me stuff because I'll be fascinated to find out.
See what that makes me think of? You know, when you say like an interaction between two species and it can cause a um like an emotion or trigger something, you know, that would come at the expense of someone else. So like if somebody's like you said, like squeezing somebody's hand and then they might feel like affection or something like that. I wonder if
Mm.
the use of AI will like cheapen the currency of that, because people might be getting reactions from AI and that would be like an infinite source, but it might cheapen it. I don't know. That's just a side shoot. Um,
I'm not going to leave that webinar.
no. No. Where were we? Fiona asks, um, my woodland is ancient woodland on green sand terrace, but the soil is only a few inches deep before the sand and stones. Why might that be? I don't remove any litter.
Mhm. Yes, so obviously you've got various geomorphic processes that are happening in terms of originally it was a rocky landscape. There was some wearing down of soil, started to create wearing down of rock that started to create soil. That's the difference between bedrock and topsoil, so to speak. And then within that, seeds started to be spread. Some of it gathered and found a home. So everything in ecology is very much about niche. When something finds its niche, where it was happy to grow, happy to live, happy to sustain itself, it will do. So yes, you will go to some areas. There was a beech tree. In fact, I think it was a photograph at the very start I put on. There's a beech tree, and the soil on which it's living is so incredibly, shockingly thin. And that's why its roots are all along the surface rather than going into it. But it's getting the nutrients it wants. It's got the stability from the bedrock that it's literally sat on top of. And it's found a niche. And within ecology, you are going to find things that have this adaptability, some more than others. A bit like people, some are more adaptable than others. Some really want the temperature set at a certain temperature. Others couldn't care less. They'll put a jumper on.
Mm.
The natural world is exactly the same. So yeah, thin soils. I used to work in Leicestershire a lot. There were some places there the soil was so incredibly thin, but the trees were gargantuous. And it's because they've spread out, they're able to get the nutrients they need, and it also forces them to be incredibly efficient as well in how they use them. So there's an internal process, and it all comes down to again things like the phloem, the lignin, in how they process those nutrients, how they store those nutrients as well, so that they can grow bigger.
Thank you. So what was the term you said? Denuded soil. We're going to call poor soil
Denuded.
that. We're remarketing it, aren't we?
Yeah.
And Peter says that the soil in Staffordshire is very dry and sandy.
Well,
Uh,
that's where I am. Yeah, I'm on Cannock Chase.
how are you?
Yeah,
Do
no.
you go mountain biking?
No, I don't have cartilage in my knees, but that's another story.
Oh, okay. Anthony says, any comment on the cultivation and use of indigenous microorganisms derived from local species-rich woodland soils to improve soil biodiversity?
If I understand the question, I think the answer is yes. So I mentioned, and this might be speaking to what he was speaking to. If not, please follow up or drop me an email so we can talk about it more. But if you find sources of local provenance species, so if you can go into your local woodlands around yours, find things that are growing, find things that are in a comparable habitat. Obviously, if you've got quite a exposed woodland on top of a hill, and you go to a very low valley wet woodland, obviously the species are going to be quite different. But if you can find a comparable species, a comparable woodland, find the species that are growing in there quite healthily, that are local to you, you're transferring local genetic strains, local provenance, that are indigenous to the area into this woodland, and you're enriching the flora there.
My mother-in-law says that.
Think,
She's a keen gardener.
right, yeah.
So, uh, and then, okay, and then this is, somebody, Michael offers, in Germany, you are legally obliged to cull the boar in your forest, otherwise you are liable for damage to local farmers' fields. So, cautionary tale about boar.
Yeah,
Um,
if anyone buys a woodland in Germany, now you know.
yeah. Sehr gut. Um, okay, I think that brings us to our to the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for all of the questions that you, the SWOG community, have provided, but mostly thank you to Paul for your giving nature and for just teaching us all so much. It's really kind that you do that. I think if anybody wants proof that soil health is really important for propagation of species, you just need to look at my house plants, because those poor things, it's like a mortuary for plants, and they've had the same soil for about 13 years. So
uh, just to say that if you go to my website, it's going through a huge change at the minute. I remember just before we came on, I've put a link down here. Just says public drive down here. I think everyone can see that. Can you see
Yes.
the website on? Yeah. So if you
Yes.
just click on public drive, it'll open it up, go into habitats, woodland management, and then you've got the various presentations and things from the last few we've done. Just wanted to make sure people knew how to find that, download it, make use of it.
Thank you. I'm sure that it will get included in next time's newsletter. We I currently don't have a webinar for September yet. I've got a few irons in the fire to sort out future webinars, but of course, keep checking on the socials and I will keep you updated. And also, please check in. Probably by 11 p.m. tonight, the webinar will be uploaded onto YouTube, but I will send that round as per usual. And just thank you as always, and especially thank you to Paul, and thank you to all the repeat SWOG customers. It's always really nice to see familiar faces. Um, you know who you are. And yeah, I'll see you in a month or so and see you on the SWOG socials. So take care, everybody, and see you all soon. Thank you.